before I bring in the fabulous, well, there he is. Do you have a dad joke? I know you're busting to do it. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dan, you know why Native Americans were here first? No. We had reservations.
That's the last dad joke he gets. Hey, JR's going to talk about your next topic to wrap up this incredible 3 days. What do you think so far?
Oh, I tell you what, this has exceeded my wildest expectations. I mean, this has been wonderful. Everyone's been so good, and it's provoking some pretty deep thinking on my part. I think we've got a lot of good work ahead of us. You know what?
I do know it, and I know that you think I'm crackers to say we're starting a movement, but we are. And I know that I'm not supposed to say this because I think we should say 1, 2, 3, announce it at the same time, but because of COVID, because of these masks, and we had to pivot in August to go hybrid and virtual, I would like to say in 2022, same time, next year, we're looking at Indigenuity 2.0. Yeah. Yay. And then one more thing, I'll leave you alone, but I will be back like a bad penny. We did a contest, and you're going to announce the winners after your talk.
Absolutely. As soon as I wrap it up, we will announce the winners, and I'm really excited about that.
I'm excited about it too, because, we make this stuff up, but we believe in it so much, somehow it works. And we had over 36 people from around the country send us great ideas. And our judges were the Indigenerds plus Dan. And you're kind of an honorary Indigenerd, I suppose. So, anyway, I'll see you for the winners, the winner circle. All right.
Absolutely.
Take it away, JR.
Well, Indigenuity is something that Dan came up with. It was started off just as an idea, and now it's kind of a movement. And so, we want to talk about how it's used in our daily lives, and that's what Dan's going to talk about today. And so it's with great honor that I get to introduce, for the last Capstone session, Mr. Dan Wildcat. Dan?
Hey, thank you, JR. Appreciate it. Sunlay. Good evening, everyone. We'd say façon, c'est la guy. Good evening. How are you? Yes, my name is Dan Wildcat. I'm a Yuchi member of the Cherokee Nation, Creek Nation of Oklahoma. So I got a lot of Creek relatives that I hope are tuned in, and Yuchi relatives. And I know some of my students, I hope, from Haskell Indian Nation University are tuned in too. But this is really has been an incredible event. And it's going to be obviously it's going to be hard to sum up, in 35, 40 minutes, what this whole event has been about and what, Indigenuity is and will continue to become, because we're constantly in movement. We're constantly changing. We're constantly growing. And so here's the first thing. Let's start with basics. I want everyone to realize I started with this when we started on Thursday, and I'm more convinced of this now. One of the beautiful things about the Museum of Native American History's Fall Festival is it is not merely a celebration of our ancestors, that history, the wisdom, the knowledge that they had. It's not just about the past. MONAH takes the position that to understand us, the first peoples of this land, you have to start with the present, and then you have to even listen to what Indigenous people have to say about the future. And I think that is so rewarding. It is so positive that we're going to have a museum where Indians just aren't under glass and in the cases with the archaeology and the pottery and the beads, all that's cool. Don't get me wrong, right? But we're more than that. We're living, we're growing, we're very creative peoples. And I think ultimately that's what the bottom line of this idea of indigenuity is all about. Indigenous ingenuity. So what do I mean by that? I mean a Yuchi, a Choctaw, a Cherokee, a Passamaquoddy, a Lummi, an Apache, a Comanche, calling on the wisdom and knowledge their ancestors had and applying that to help us solve very contemporary problems that indigenous people didn't create. It's a hopeful activity. It's an intrinsically creative activity. Problems emerge, problems change, situations change, conditions are always in flux. And this is what I like about indigenuity. When we think about the richness of our traditions, whether those be ceremonies, customs, habits, thank God many of us have a language. Some of us, like my Zoyaha relatives, are working mightily to preserve the language, revitalize our language, our Yuchi language. And we've got all of that. Customs, habits, traditions, ceremonies, songs, prayers, language. I think that we're at a point now to where the challenge is to recognize that, we do have a lot that's wrong in the world today. There's a lot that we need to address, and they are deep systemic problems. We use that term all the time. These are systemic problems. And that can kind of be paralyzing at one level, because people will go like, oh, well, it's a system problem. How am I, this one person, going to do anything that's going to make a difference? Well, we have seen all through the last 3 days, indigenous people making a difference. The indigeneurs, astronauts, women in science, engineering, and math. Of course, we don't talk in Indian country. I prefer not to talk about just STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. I like to talk about STEAM. We're gathering up STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. We've talked about archaeology. Oh, my goodness, I'll be forever indebted to Wiyoti Old Bear walking me through what indigenous futurism is. And again, what did she emphasize? Really, it's drawing on the past to imagine, to create, to think a future. And I shared this. There are indigenous peoples in North America who believe that the past does sometimes, or the future sometimes comes to one in a dream or a vision before it is ever realized or emerges as a reality. That to me is the heartbeat of indigenuity. And we have such rich traditions about this. I mean, my gosh, we talked about, surviving the zombie apocalypse. What a pop culture theme, right? Surviving. And what did we talk about? Well, our geographies, knowing our geographies, knowing our ancient medicines, the plant medicines we had, knowing how to hunt. These were the point was, our ancestors have gone through a lot. And in some ways, I think, the downside of the settler and colonial history has been that with this systemic effort with the federal Indian boarding schools to erase every vestige of who we were as a Lakota, a Comanche, a Creek, a Chickasaw, a Passamaquoddy, a Seminole, a Cheyenne human being, to erase that world from us of what it meant to be a Cheyenne or Zoyaha human being. It's amazing now that we're coming around to a point where I think we not only have an opportunity, but we have a responsibility to the relatives we share our lives with. And I'm talking about the land, the air, the water, the plants, the animals, to begin to explore and help solve problems we had nothing to do in creating. You can't blame the Chickasaw or the Cherokees or the Blackfeet or the Hopi or the Dene for creating the kinds of problems we face in the modern world today. And I started the first day, I think, with a quote. I'll repeat it. It's apocryphal because no one can actually find where Einstein said this, right? But it's alleged that he told a colleague one time when he was asked to comment on a very difficult problem that he said, remember, you can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking that created them. The bad news is we've got a lot of problems, folks. The good news is I believe through exercises of indigenuity, we could have a generation of Navajo scientists, Navajo doctors, Navajo engineers, Lakota architects, Zoyaha, artists. We could have a generation of people who have been mindful and have a tradition of mindfulness about the world around them, and who have it within their tribal memory, their tribal intellectual traditions, customs, and habits, the sources for solutions to these problems. Remember, you can't solve problems with the same kind of thinking. If we need people who aren't thinking in the same way that the people who and not intentionally, but just as a consequence of the way they thought about the world and understood it. If we have people here who possess worldviews that are very different, are equally, I would argue, probably somewhat biased in a biased or prejudicial manner, more sophisticated than some of the older ways of, thinking about the physical universe we inhabit, then I think as good relatives that we have a responsibility to try to help address some of the issues. Now we know, it's not just us alone. And I want to emphasize this about indigenuity. We talked about this, by the way, just with the astronauts, didn't we, about the co-production of knowledge. So people talk about, we've got to get out of the thinking in boxes. We've got to get out of working in silos. The biologists seldom talk to the engineers in the academy, and the engineers never talk to a poet or an artist. And then they've got all the people who do economic modeling, and they're over in another building. And no one ever talks together or comes together to solve problems. Roger Pawardi of NOAA works at the lab in Boulder, Colorado, once famously remarked to a group of scientists he was presenting to, he says, this was in a university, by the way. He says, look around you. He says, here's the situation we're in. The world has problems, and we all work in departments. The problems of the world don't fit in any one little niche. As our ancestors understood, they're all related. They're all connected. Now, this can seem daunting, and here's the point, overwhelming. But we've got to remember, I use that term relatives. I've talked about this a lot, but I'll say it again. Oren Lyons summed it up best at the 25th anniversary of Earth Day when he was giving, as usual, some of his eloquent remarks. And Oren Lyons made the comment, said, be careful about the words you use. He says, when we get scientists that come to talk to us about how to better manage our resources, I always correct them and tell them, we don't have any resources. We live among relatives. Wow. We live among relatives. Part of indigenuity, and the part I want to emphasize, is that active part of our imagination can be greatly fueled by the world around us. I want to say something very clearly. The world, as I said, has problems. And, it's hard sometimes to even watch the news. I mean, the world is filled with considerable ugliness. But children, parents, grandparents, remember, most of that ugliness is created by humans. And if we can step out of doors, no matter where you're at, it could even be a big city. If you can walk around long enough and start to get a sense of a place, mindful of the air you breathe. You want to be careful. You want to make sure, you try to do your best to make sure that air is clean. That's a crime that we have places where it's dangerous to breathe the air. It's dangerous to drink the water. The land is contaminated. People have not been paying attention. But here's the good news. The world is still there full of relatives to teach us how to be better, more competent, more mature human beings if we start paying attention. They can teach us something. So, when Robin Kimmerer, talks about the Council of Pecan Trees in her book, she's literally talking about, they have a council, they communicated. And she talks about how she translates that into learning something about what we need to do. In other words, these themes all overlap and they interrelate. And this is where the imagination gets unleashed. You make connections in ways typically you would not. So, Jose Hernandez, a beautiful statement about, what he said, what he was most fascinated with when he got in space and he looked at the Earth. There are no boundaries. There's no lines marking where, one nation ends and another begins. The Earth systems of this planet don't recognize governmental boundaries. The fish, there's no indication that the fish do or the birds do. And it seems to me that we're on the cusp of a time where we have the opportunity to draw on a piece of ancient wisdom that seems very commonly shared among many indigenous people in North America, possibly around the world. And that is that notion that we are all related, we are all connected. And so we have a lot to learn. And Robin Kimmerer's book, by the way, if you haven't read it, please do. But it's a book about how the plants, the earth itself, can teach us how to be better human beings. But we have to pay attention. We haven't been paying very much attention lately. We haven't been mindful of this beautiful blue-green planet that some of us refer to as Mother Earth. It's our mother, it's our home. And in some ways, I think we've kind of insulated ourselves into ignorance. And I would just encourage everyone to make a very mindful, a self-conscious effort to not take the land, not take the water, not take the air for granted. Oh, where are you going to get your water tonight? Well, I'm just going to go turn on my faucet and the water comes out. Do you know where that water came from? Do you know what kind of processes that water had to go through to be drinkable for you? What's the likelihood that source will be there in the future? These are practical questions. These are not esoteric questions. These are very practical questions. I'm advocating for indigenuity, that people start paying attention to the places they call home. And the best exemplars of this are indigenous people, native people, who took their culture, their languages, their ceremonies, how they lived, the kind of clothes they wore, the kinds of homes they built, all from the places that they called home, okay? We got their medicines from, if they lived in the woodlands in the forest, if they lived in the southeast, maybe from along the riverbanks in the forest, maybe in the wetlands. And it's nothing, there's nothing esoteric or romantic about this. It is simply a call to say, if we start really paying attention to the life around us, and we see the beauty that resides there. And as I mentioned, when Robin Kimmerer and I talked about the notion that, the world is full of gifts. When we come into this world, none of us had to fill out a credit application to see if we were credit worthy. We didn't have to fill out an application to make sure we could be a member of the human race. And we were surrounded with all of this. Robin says abundance. I think she's right. And when we say, well, why do people starve? Why do some people not have money? That's the human systems we've created. We can do better. And, I love the theme that museum staff, and it wasn't mine. I mean, we talked through this. We talked, you learn things from other people by listening. And as we kept talking about, what's the theme we want to use for our contest this year, for all of these young people to think about indigenuity. And, again, the world is out there. The solutions, the answers are in here. It's not either or. It's both. It's that is out here, the inspiration for our ideas, our thoughts. And now we do have this whole pop culture phenomenon with these kinds of tools and everything. And I think one of the things we will continue to talk about is how do we use this kind of technology in a very life-enhancing manner? Because we can see that sometimes this very technology, this tool, okay, can be used for ill purposes, can be used to hurt others, harm others, threaten others, and make people fearful of the world. But again, I would say, as powerful as this technology is, don't let it overwhelm you, because you can turn it off for a while and step out of doors, wherever you are. Now you've got to be careful. I realize there might be some people who are turning in. I hope there are, maybe someone from the south side of Chicago. Man, you talk about illustrating problems that are very real. Man, we need some serious indigenuity. We can't keep trying the same thing over and over. Let's try something different. And indigenuity, I think it's an idea that it can be manifested in your everyday life, how you solve very practical problems. It can be manifested in the kinds of relationships you have with people. I've just recently got involved with people who do what they call public philosophy. And so this is the philosophy that is public in the sense that it either deals with public issues, or else the philosophy is done in a public setting, not in a university setting, okay? Not in a research institute setting, okay? With the professor surrounded by piles and piles of books. But no, it's done in the world. And it really, and then I saw the term recently, people talking about embodied culture, embodied philosophy. And I got to thinking, yeah, that's what indigenous people have. You try to embody the change you want to see. Now, we're all imperfect. We're all flawed. We make mistakes. But here's the good thing when you live among relatives. If you make a mistake, you're hoping one of your relatives will come along and say, hey, Dan, I think you made a mistake here. I want to talk to you about this. And you can visit about it. And then think of what that means when we start expanding that notion of our families, of our relatives, to the forest, to the rivers, to the grasslands. Nothing romantic about this at all. This is indigenous realism. The reason we have problem with water quality, soil quality, and air quality, people act like it didn't matter. They took it for granted. Some of us have not been paying attention. We have not been mindful. Indigenuity is an exercise in mindfulness, I think, ultimately. And it's recognizing that our traditions are living traditions. Oh my gosh, this program has been marvelous. We've heard from artists, those who do traditional arts, those who are trying to preserve and understand the craftsmanship of our ancestors. And then the indigenerds, people who are talking about comic books and pop culture and anime and all of this stuff that as they reemphasize, you know, we're expressing who we are as indigenous people, and we're writing those narratives. No one is writing them for us. So maybe this is that opportunity to imagine something, to dream something. And then the question is how that becomes a reality. It's true that, as a general rule, our ancestors weren't thinking about what was scheduled tomorrow or next week, didn't even think in those terms, right? They weren't living on a paper calendar or a clock that might be contained here or a wristwatch. They were living in the world, with the world. And now, as John and Jose shared, two marvelous NASA astronauts, now we imagine the cosmos, the universe. And Jose said something really profound. He said, I don't think we really have reached the maturity level to be going out and trying to, find new life. He says, I don't think we're ready. But maybe we'll be ready if we can survive the mess we've created in the past couple of 100 years on this Mother Earth. I think we can survive it. And I think the answers are found in exercises of indigenuity. Look around you, pay attention. You can start to see where there are opportunities to strengthen systems of life enhancement. Again, I guess if there's a common denominator about this kind of exercise of indigenuity I'm talking about, it really has to do with this notion that it's not all about us. That as we go through this life, if you can make that shift, that worldview shift, to say, guess what? I'm going to walk out the door and I'm going to try on this lens. What would it look like if I saw myself as surrounded by relatives? As I've said before, a couple of things immediately happen. The first thing happens is you don't treat relatives like resources, do you? Now, that's the way we treat the other life around us. It's a resource. For whom? Oh, well, for us. I think that single idea is probably one of the most foreign ideas to the vast majority of indigenous people on the planet. That it never occurred to them that all of this was in any kind of ownership sense theirs. But that they had this appreciation for respecting it because they knew their lives depended on it. Again, nothing romantic. You pay attention to the water because you're going to be drinking out of that river. By the way, what did the water defenders tell us at Standing Rock? Water is life. And I loved it. When they were there, they said, don't call us protesters. We're not protesters. We are water protectors. And what we need today is a whole generation of earth protectors, water protectors, soil protectors, plant protectors, animal protectors. And to re-engage these ancient relationships that we had with this life around us. That was the source of indigenous wisdom. The experience of being part of a world much larger than you. And to the extent that we live in a room full of mirrors today where we're constantly just looking at things we've made and our images, I think we can forget. Sometimes we don't pay attention. Maybe we're distracted, okay? And we're not being mature human beings and behaving in a responsible way, because the resource view, people just argue about resources and their rights. Well, we know all about people concerned with their rights. We've seen that in the middle of a global pandemic. But when you live among relatives, you have to exercise unalienable responsibilities then that you have to have. This point comes up over and over again in different of our tribal traditions. This notion of responsibility. We have inalienable responsibilities. Somewhere along the line, we got so fixated on our human rights. And don't get me wrong, I mean, indigenous people have as high a respect for the unique gifts every one of us possesses as a unique person on this planet as anyone. And the whole goal is to what? To enhance, to raise up those gifts you've been given. But we realize any discussion of rights is hollow unless it's counterbalanced with the recognition of responsibilities. Your responsibility is to live in a way that people will have the opportunities and the rights to fully enact everything that they can be, to fully develop their potential. All of this is bound up in this idea of indigenuity. I think we're going to have the opportunity, folks, to, there's some things we haven't touched on yet. We've talked about so much: engineering, arts, pop culture, indigenous futurism. But we've got some talk maybe about psychology, about governance, what we can learn from governance by exercises of indigenuity, about, again, how we think and how we might draw on the wisdom of our ancestors to maybe deal with some of the real problems we face today. So we've got just tremendous opportunities. And I think the good thing about indigenuity, it's a relational concept. The knowledge, everything is out here, right? The knowledge is around us and the answers. How we apply that, it's here. It's in that spirit. It's in our mind. It's in our heart. By the way, those two aren't, how do you separate those? It takes a lot of people thinking in boxes, in silos, to separate those things. They're never separated. I'm going to close with again, I mentioned Einstein earlier, but Einstein, that was an apocryphal quote. This is a real quote this is what Einstein said about imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited. Whereas imagination embraces the entire world, the entire cosmos, the universe. So it stimulates progress. Well, progress in terms of, I would say, if we're going to define progress, not an anthropocentric process. Now, I'm taking his words and tweaking them, but progress in maybe a broader sense of life enhancement. Giving birth to evolution, change. Everything is constantly changed. You know, Oscar Coaglia, a Yupik elder and a dear friend and a mentor used to say, yeah, the only constant in this world is change. And Native people understood how to look for changes, how to see changes. By the way, that's why Indigenous people are sounding the alarm now about climate change. They're not reading scientific papers. They are seeing it. They are living it. That's how they understand it. They've been paying attention. They continue to pay attention. So I want to encourage everyone to think about how you might exercise some indigenuity. Another incredible Indigenous artist and thinker, Scott Momaday, in his last book, Earthkeepers, it's a thin little volume, but towards the end of it, he says, I think what we're facing now is a poverty of the imagination. And I want to thank everyone at this MONAH celebration, our celebration of Indigenuity, to constantly reminding everyone of what Einstein realized and what our ancestors knew, the power of imagination, the power of a vision, the power of a dream. And we have difficult problems, but we need to draw on the wisdom of people who have some very complex, systematic ways of thinking about the world that didn't create these problems that we now face, but may very well hold the solutions to solving some of those problems. At least give it a try. We don't have anything to lose. Potentially, we have a lot to gain. So I want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to be here in this virtual space with you, for the opportunity over the last year to make such good friends at MONAH. And I tell you what, when we shut in this today, we're going to post all of this stuff, but I'm really excited because we're going to start thinking about next year. And Charlotte, you're absolutely right. We're going to talk about Indigenuity 2.0, okay? And we'll all get together and do that.